My father's laughter was a sound I knew by heart, sharp, condescending, and loud enough to fill the entire Chicago ballroom. He stood on that stage, a glass of $500 scotch in one hand, pointing at me like I was the punchline of a joke he'd been telling for 30 years. To the 200 guests watching, I was the failed daughter who couldn't hold down a real job. But what they didn't know was that while my father was rehearsing his insults, I was signing a document that would make me the most powerful person in that room. My name is Sloane Thorne. I am 30 years old, and 2 hours ago, I became the person my father always feared I would be, the one who doesn't need him. The air in the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the suffocating weight of 3 decades of expectations. I sat at table 12, far enough from the stage to be ignored, but close enough to see the glint of the gold Rolex on my father's wrist as he adjusted the microphone. This was his night, Arthur Thorne's retirement gala. After 40 years of crushing competitors in the Chicago real estate market, the king of concrete was finally stepping down. I looked at my phone, the screen glowing dimly against the white linen tablecloth. A single notification sat there, a silent witness to a revolution. It was an email from the legal department at Global Tech Acquisitions. The deal was done. Prism AI, the startup I had built in a tiny, drafty apartment while my father told the neighbors I was finding myself, had just been acquired for $50 million. But on that stage, Arthur wasn't talking about acquisitions. He was talking about Preston. Preston, my stepbrother, who sat to his right, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first year of college. Preston was the chosen one, the protege, the son Arthur always wanted. You know, Arthur said into the microphone, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who has never been corrected. Success isn't just about what you build, it's about having the spine to hold it up. I've been lucky. I have Preston here, who's ready to take the Thorne name into the next decade. He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. The spotlight didn't move, but the eyes of everyone at the head table did. And then, Arthur continued, a smirk playing on his lips, there are those who think they can reinvent the wheel with apps and algorithms. My daughter Sloane spent 5 years chasing a ghost. She called it a career. I called it an expensive hobby. The room erupted in polite, stifled titters. I saw my stepmother Cassandra lean back and whisper something to the woman next to her, her diamond necklace catching the light. She looked at me with a mix of pity and triumph. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation in my throat, the one I'd carried since I was 10 years old. But this time, I didn't look away. I didn't blush. I simply took a sip of my water and felt the cold weight of the arithmetic in my head. My father laughed, that booming, hollow sound, and raised his glass. To a real career, Preston. I looked down at my phone one last time. The transfer was pending. 90 days. That was the window. In exactly 90 days, the company Arthur Thorne had spent 40 years building would be looking for a buyer to save it from the debt Cassandra and Preston had hidden from him. And I was the only one with the capital to buy it. My name is Sloane Thorne. For most of my life, I was the girl in the background of the Thorne family portraits, the blurry figure at the edge of the frame who didn't quite fit the aesthetic. My father, Arthur, was a man who measured human worth in concrete, steel, and profit margins. If you couldn't see it, touch it, or sell it, it wasn't real to him. This philosophy left very little room for a daughter who wanted to build worlds out of code and logic instead of bricks and mortar. Before we dive deeper into the night the king of concrete realized his throne was made of sand, if you believe that success is defined by your own hard work and not by someone else's insults, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing these stories of resilience and truth. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading about our global community. Now, let's go back to where the cracks in our family first began. I was only 7 when my mother passed away. She was the warmth in our home, the one who told me my imagination was a superpower. When she died, the house became a cold, silent museum of Arthur's achievements. But that silence didn't last. 2 years later, Cassandra arrived, bringing with her a sharp, calculated smile and her son, Preston. Suddenly, I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was an obstacle in the way of the perfect new family they were determined to build. They say home is where the heart is, but in the Thorne household, home was a balance sheet, and I was a line item that never seemed to add up. I grew up in a sprawling, 6-bedroom limestone mansion in the suburbs of Chicago, a house that Arthur Thorne liked to remind everyone he built with his own 2 hands, one concrete slab at a time. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, cold glass, sharp edges, and white marble floors that were so polished you could see the ghost of your own reflection staring back at you. For the first 7 years of my life, that house had warmth. My mother was the one who provided the insulation against my father's cold, corporate nature. She was a woman of logic and light, a former mathematics professor who saw the world in beautiful, complex patterns. I remember sitting at our heavy oak kitchen table while she taught me that everything beautiful starts with a solid foundation. She didn't use building blocks, she used logic puzzles and early computer games. She told me that code was just another language for building cathedrals, only these cathedrals lived in the mind. When she died, the insulation was stripped away. Ovarian cancer moved through her like a wrecking ball, leaving me and Arthur standing in the debris of a life we didn't know how to navigate without her. My father didn't know how to be a parent, he only knew how to be a CEO. He looked at my grief like it was a project behind schedule. He wanted results, not tears. And his solution for a broken foundation arrived exactly 18 months later in the form of Cassandra. I remember the day Cassandra moved in. She didn't walk into our house, she occupied it. She arrived with a fleet of moving trucks and a 7-year-old son named Preston, who looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that came with the lease. Cassandra was the human equivalent of a high-gloss finish. Expensive, hard, and impossible to scratch. She wore Chanel suits like armor and spoke in a voice that was always an octave too pleasant, the kind of tone that made a command sound like a suggestion and an insult sound like a compliment. Within the first year, the erasure began. It wasn't a sudden demolition, it was a slow, methodical renovation of my existence. First, it was the photos. My mother's portraits were moved from the hallway to the attic, replaced by professional shots of Arthur, Cassandra, and Preston, looking like a perfect, cohesive unit. I was in the photos too, but I was always at the very edge, half stepping out of the frame, a blurry footnote in their new narrative. Then, it was my room. One Saturday morning, while Arthur was at the office, Cassandra walked into my bedroom with 2 men in overalls. "Sloan, honey," she said, her smile never reaching her cold eyes. "Preston really needs a space for his gaming setup, and since you're so quiet and spend all your time on that little laptop anyway, we've moved your things to the guest suite in the basement." The guest suite was a windowless room next to the furnace. My posters were replaced by Preston's trophies. My books were boxed and hidden. I became a guest in my own home, someone who was tolerated rather than loved. Arthur didn't fight for me. He never fought for anything that didn't have a profit margin. When I complained, he just looked at his gold Rolex and said, "Sloan, don't be difficult. Cassandra is just trying to make this family work. Why can't you be more like Preston?" Preston was the golden child. He played football, he was loud, and he worshipped the ground Arthur walked on. Arthur saw himself in Preston, the same arrogance, the same obsession with physical power. He started taking Preston to job sites on the weekends, showing him how to pour concrete and negotiate with contractors. Meanwhile, I would sit in the shadows of the basement, my face illuminated by the blue light of my screen, building my own world. I was learning to code, creating algorithms that could predict trends my father couldn't even see coming. At the dinner table, the divide was absolute. Arthur and Preston would talk about real work, steel, labor, and property, while Cassandra would beam at them like they were kings. If I spoke about my interest in software or the potential of artificial intelligence, Arthur would let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Software, Sloan? That's not a career. It's a hobby for people who are afraid to get their hands dirty," he'd say, raising his glass to Preston. I realized then that I was a rough draft my father had decided to revise out of his life. I was the useless daughter, the one who didn't fit the brand. But as I sat there, swallowing my dinner and my pride, I realized that if I couldn't have a seat at their table, I would build a table of my own, one that was worth more than the entire Thorn Empire. If you want to know the exact moment the bridge between me and my father collapsed, it wasn't at the retirement gala. It was on a humid Tuesday evening in July, sitting in Arthur's mahogany-paneled study while the scent of his expensive cigars hung in the air like a fog. I was 18, clutching an acceptance letter from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, like it was a golden ticket. I had worked my tail off, staying up until 3 a.m. for 3 years, mastering calculus and self-teaching Python, all for this one moment. I got into the computer science program, Dad, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of pride and terror. Arthur didn't even look up from the blueprints spread across his desk. He was tracing a line on a new residential development project with a gold-plated pen. Computer science? He repeated, the word sounding like a bad taste in his mouth. Sloan, we've discussed this. You're going to Northwestern. You're going to study business administration and real estate law. That is what a Thorn does. We build things people can actually stand on. We don't play with virtual nonsense. But I don't want to build malls, Dad. I want to build systems, algorithms. I want to solve problems that aren't made of concrete, I pleaded. That was when he finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, professional, and entirely devoid of fatherly warmth. Let me be very clear, Sloan. A career is something that produces a tangible asset. Software is a toy. It's a hobby for people who are afraid to get their hands dirty on a job site. If you choose this path, you're choosing it alone. I'm not investing my hard-earned capital in a ghost career. I looked at Cassandra, who was leaning against the doorframe, sipping a glass of chilled Chardonnay. She gave me a look of practiced pity. Sloan, honey, she cooed. Your father is just trying to protect you. Look at Preston. He's already started his internship at the firm. He's learning how to manage crews, how to talk to city council. He's building a future. Why must you be so difficult? Preston, who was 19 and had failed his freshman economics class twice, was already driving a brand new BMW that Arthur had bought him as an encouragement gift. While I was being told my dreams were ghosts, Preston was being treated like a king for simply showing up. I walked out of that room with a fire in my chest that I had never felt before. If my father wasn't going to invest in me, I would invest in myself. I declined the MIT offer. It was too expensive without his help, and enrolled in a state university with a solid tech program. I took out every student loan available. I worked 3 jobs, a barista from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., a library assistant in the afternoons, and a freelance coder for small businesses until the sun came up. I remember one Thanksgiving break. I came home exhausted, my eyes bloodshot from staring at code, my hands shaking from too much caffeine. I walked into the dining room where the whole family was gathered. Arthur was at the head of the table, raising a toast to Preston. To my son, Arthur boomed. He just closed his first small deal on a suburban lot. That's a real man's work. Bricks and mortar, son. That's where the power is. Preston smirked at me. Hey Sloan, how's the typing going? You made any of those millions you promised yet? Or are you still just making coffee for people with real jobs? The table erupted in laughter. Even the aunts and uncles joined in. I was the family joke, the useless daughter who was wasting her life on pixels and play pretend. I sat there, staring at my plate of turkey, feeling like an alien in my own skin. I realized then that my father's definition of real work was a prison. To him, if you couldn't drop a heavy rock on it, it didn't exist. He couldn't see the invisible architecture that was starting to run the world. He was a dinosaur watching the comet hit the Earth and laughing because the rock looked shiny. By my senior year, the gap was a canyon. Arthur stopped calling. If I reached out, I got Cassandra. Your father is so busy, Sloan. The business is facing some headwinds, you know. Real estate is a tough game. We really don't have time for your little school projects. When I graduated, I didn't even ask them to come. I sat in that stadium among 500 other students, and when they called my name, I stood up and walked across that stage alone. No flowers from Arthur, no celebratory dinner from Cassandra. Just a diploma and $60,000 in debt. I moved into a studio apartment in a rough part of the city. The radiator clanked all night, and the only piece of furniture I had was a folding desk and a high-end server I had built myself with parts I'd scavenged. I started Prism AI there, in the dark, while the rest of the Thorne family was celebrating Preston's promotion to Vice President of Development, a title he had done nothing to earn. My father's firm, Thorne Real Estate, was his kingdom, and he was convinced it was invincible. He didn't see that the market was shifting. He didn't see that his debt-to-equity ratio was ballooning. He didn't see that the world was moving toward the very algorithms he mocked. I spent those early years in a state of pure, clinical focus. I was building a machine learning model that could analyze urban development trends, predict property devaluations, and optimize supply chains with 99% accuracy. It was the very tool my father needed to save his company. But he wouldn't even know it existed for another 5 years. Every time I felt like quitting, when the power got cut because I couldn't pay the bill, or when I was eating ramen for the 10th night in a row, I would hear his voice. "You'll never make a dime, Sloan. It's an expensive hobby." I'd look at my reflection in the dark computer screen and whisper back, "Just watch me, Arthur. Just watch." The divide wasn't just about jobs. It was about respect. In the Thorne family, you earned respect with volume, with physical presence, and with unearned arrogance. I was quiet. I was precise. I was building a cathedral out of logic while they were still trying to figure out how to stack stones. I knew that one day their stones would start to crumble, and when they did, they would realize that the failed daughter was the only one who knew how to hold up the sky. The apartment I moved into after graduation was a far cry from the limestone mansion of my childhood. It was a third-floor walk-up in a part of Chicago where the streetlights hummed with a nervous energy and the sirens were the only lullaby you'd ever hear. The radiator clanked at 4 a.m. like a ghost trying to break free from the walls, and the windows were so thin that the winter wind felt like a physical hand pressing against my chest. My office was a folding card table I'd bought at a garage sale for $10, and my staff was a high-end server I'd built myself from salvaged parts, its cooling fan providing the only steady rhythm to my life. For 3 years, I lived in the shadows. While my father, Arthur, was appearing on the covers of local business journals, and Preston was being photographed at charity galas with Cassandra, I was a ghost. I ate ramen noodles for dinner 20 nights a month. I wore the same 3 sweaters until the elbows wore thin. I learned to sleep in 4-hour increments, because code doesn't wait for you to feel rested. My father's definition of success was physical: buildings you could touch, ceremonies you could attend, and people you could dominate. My success was invisible. I was building Prism AI. It started as a predictive algorithm, a piece of software that could analyze urban development patterns, interest rate fluctuations, and zoning laws faster than a room full of analysts. I wasn't just guessing where the next big development would be. I was calculating it down to the decimal point. I remember a rare phone call from Arthur during my second year of struggle. I had hoped for a "how are you?" or perhaps a "do you need help with rent?" Instead, his voice was tight, impatient. "Sloan, Cassandra mentioned you were seen working at a coffee shop downtown. Is that what you spent 4 years of school for? To be a barista?" "It's a part-time job to fund my server costs, Dad," I explained, my voice flat. "I'm building something. Prism is almost ready for beta testing." I heard his sharp, dry laugh, the one that always felt like a slap. "Prism? Still with the toys? Listen, I talked to Preston. He's looking for someone to handle the digital filing at the firm. It's an entry-level clerical position, but it's a real job, with a real paycheck. Stop this nonsense and come work for your brother. At least then you won't be an embarrassment to the Thorne name." "I'm not coming to work for Preston, Dad." "Fine," he snapped. "But don't come crying to me when your pixels don't pay the electric bill. I'm done investing in someone who refuses to see reality." He hung up, and for a moment, the silence of the apartment felt heavier than the Chicago winter. I looked at my screen, at the thousands of lines of code I had written by hand. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time, it was different. It was the fuel. I went back to work. While the Thorne family was celebrating Preston's genius in expanding their portfolio, mostly by taking out massive, high-interest loans that my algorithm flagged as high risk, I was quietly gaining traction. I started as a consultant for small tech firms, using my software to optimize their logistics. Then, a mid-sized hedge fund in New York contacted me. They didn't care that I lived in a walk-up or that my furniture was held together by duct tape. They cared about the results. In 3 months, Prism AI saved them $4 million in bad land acquisitions. My first real paycheck was for $50,000. I didn't buy a car. I didn't move. I bought better servers. I hired my first developer, a brilliant kid from my university who was just as hungry as I was. We worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared obsession with precision. The irony was that while I was building my fortress of logic, my father's fortress of concrete was beginning to crack. Through my data, I could see Thorn Real Estate's movements. I could see the debt they were accumulating to stay relevant in a market that was shifting toward tech-integrated developments. Arthur was still playing the game like it was 1995, relying on gut feelings and old-school handshakes, while Preston was siphoning money for his lifestyle, disguising it as business development. I attended one family dinner during this period, Arthur's 59th birthday. Cassandra had organized it at an Italian place where the napkins cost more than my weekly groceries. Preston spent the entire night talking about his new yacht and the killing he was going to make on a West Side development project. "What about you, Sloane?" Cassandra asked, her voice dripping with that fake, honey-coated pity. "Are you still doing that computer thing? Or have you finally looked into that position at the firm? Your father is so worried about your future." I looked at my father. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He was busy listening to Preston brag. "I'm doing okay, Cassandra," I said quietly. "Prism is growing." Preston snickered. "Growth in what? Your follower count? Come on, Sloane. Dad's firm just cleared a $10 million deal. That's what growth looks like, not some app that probably has 10 users." I touched the silver bracelet on my wrist, my mother's bracelet. I thought about the $3 million contract I had signed that morning with a global logistics giant. I thought about the fact that my algorithm had predicted the exact failure of the West Side project Preston was so excited about. But I didn't say a word. I had learned that in the Thorne family, the truth was only respected if it came with a loud voice and a bigger ego. I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to be right. By the end of year 4, Prism AI wasn't just a startup. It was a disruptor. We were no longer chasing clients. They were chasing us. We had moved into a clean, minimalist office in Tribeca. I had 23 employees. My face wasn't on the news, but my software was in the back end of every major acquisition in the city. Then, the news broke in the tech world. Global Tech Acquisitions, GTA, the biggest player in the market, was looking for a proprietary AI system to revolutionize their real estate wing. They didn't go to Arthur Thorne. They didn't go to the established firms. They came to me. The negotiations lasted 3 months. 3 months of legal due diligence, technical audits, and high-stakes meetings. My father and Preston had no idea. To them, I was still the useless daughter who probably lived on credit cards. They didn't know that every time they saw a headline about a secretive tech genius or a major industry shift, they were looking at the shadow I had cast over their world. The final offer arrived on a Tuesday, $50 million for a full acquisition. I would stay on as a consultant, but the intellectual property, the empire I had built out of nothing, was now worth more than my father's entire life's work. I sat in my office, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of my father's laughter. I felt the lightness of victory. The retirement gala was in 2 weeks. Arthur had sent the invitation with a note. "Try to look professional for once. Don't make me explain your situation to my partners." I didn't reply. I just signed the GTA contract and started preparing my own speech, one that didn't need a microphone to be heard. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a heavy, cream-colored envelope that felt like a summons from a past I was trying to outrun. It was delivered to my minimalist office in Tribeca, standing out against the sleek glass and black steel of my desk like a relic from a dying age. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The gold-embossed T on the wax seal was Arthur's signature touch, a symbol of a dynasty built on concrete that was slowly beginning to crack. I opened it with a letter opener I'd bought myself, my hands perfectly steady. Inside, the cardstock was thick enough to be a weapon. Celebrating 40 years of excellence, the retirement of Arthur Thorne. Below the formal text, there was a handwritten note in my father's sharp, slanted script. "Try to look professional for once, Sloane. I've invited the city's top investors and my future partners. Don't make me spend the night explaining your situation to people who actually work for a living. Wear something that doesn't look like it came from a thrift store." I stared at the note for a long time. It wasn't the insult that hit me. I was immune to those by now. It was the irony. At the exact moment I was reading his condescending advice on how to look professional, my second monitor was flashing with a final confirmation from my legal team. The $50 million acquisition of Prism AI by Global Tech was entering its final hour of due diligence. While my father was worried about the price of my dress, I was looking at a bank balance that would soon dwarf his entire liquid net worth. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was a text from Cassandra. "Sloan, we've arranged a special family portrait for the gala. Preston is wearing his custom Armani. Please don't be late. We have a very tight schedule for the photographers." I didn't reply. I looked at the invitation again and then at the window, watching the rain streak across the Chicago skyline. They wanted a performance. They wanted me to show up as the failed daughter, the cautionary tale they could point to while they crowned Preston as the new king of a crumbling empire. They needed me there to make themselves feel successful. I picked up my pen and signed the final page of the acquisition contract. The ink was black, bold, and final. "You want a show, Arthur?" I whispered to the empty room. "I'll give you a show." I called my assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the night of the 14th, and call that boutique on Michigan Avenue. I need something black, sharp, and expensive. Not because my father asked, but because I'm about to bury his legacy." I felt a cold, clinical sense of peace. For 23 years, I had been the one reacting to their moves. I had been the one defending my choices, justifying my existence, and swallowing their pity. But the math had changed. The structure was now in my favor. I wasn't going to that gala to seek their approval or to beg for a seat at their table. I was going there to watch the foundation of their arrogance finally meet the weight of the truth. The grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel was a sea of crystal, silk, and the kind of arrogance that only 40 years of unchecked power can buy. Every corner of the room was a monument to Arthur Thorne. Golden T emblems were embroidered on the chair covers, and oversized black and white portraits of Arthur's most famous skyscrapers lined the walls like silent guards. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne, the smell of the Chicago elite coming together to witness the end of an era. I walked through the double doors at exactly 7:30 p.m. I was wearing the black dress I had chosen, a piece of architectural precision in silk. It didn't scream for attention, but it demanded respect. I felt like a dark streak of reality in a room full of gilded illusions. As I moved toward the back tables, I could feel the eyes. They weren't the eyes of friends or colleagues. They were the eyes of people who had been briefed on the Thorne family dynamic. They saw me as the missing piece that didn't fit, the loose thread in Arthur's perfectly woven tapestry. Cassandra found me before I could reach my seat at table 12. She was draped in a silver gown that looked like liquid mercury, her neck adorned with a diamond collar that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. "Sloan, darling," she said, her voice a sharp, polished weapon. "You actually came. And in that. It's very minimal. I suppose it's practical for someone in your situation." She didn't wait for a reply. She never did. She leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume cloying and sweet. "Just try to stay in the shadows tonight, okay? Your father is in such a wonderful mood. Let's not remind him of the disappointment." She patted my arm and glided away toward the head table, where Preston was already holding court. He looked flushed, his tuxedo jacket tight across his shoulders, laughing a little too loudly with a group of investors. He saw me and raised his glass with a smirk that was pure victory. He thought he had won. He thought the crown was being placed on his head tonight because he was the one who followed the rules, the one who stayed in the real world of concrete. At 8:30 p.m., the lights dimmed. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, landing on the podium at the center of the stage. My father, Arthur Thorne, stepped into the light. The room erupted in a standing ovation that lasted for 3 full minutes. He stood there, soaking it in, his hands gripping the edges of the mahogany lectern. He looked like a king at his coronation, rather than a man at his retirement. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers, shaking the very crystal in my hand. 40 years. They say you can't build a legacy on sand, and tonight, looking at all of you, I know I built mine on rock. He began his speech with the hits: the 1995 housing boom, the acquisition of the riverfront properties, the sheer physical labor of turning Chicago's skyline into his personal portfolio. He spoke for 20 minutes about the sanctity of the trade. He used words like tangible, solid, physical, and real. Every time he used those words, he looked directly at Preston. "Success," Arthur continued, his eyes narrowing as the tone of his voice shifted from nostalgic to instructional, "is about choosing the right foundation. It's about knowing what matters and what is just noise. I've been blessed to have a son like Preston, who understands the weight of a Thorne legacy. He knows that a building doesn't stand on concepts. It stands on steel." The room applauded. Preston beamed. And then the air in the room seemed to chill. Arthur adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto mine at table 12. "But every legacy has its lessons," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming clinical. "And tonight, I want to be honest with my peers. We often talk about our triumphs, but we rarely talk about our failures. And perhaps my greatest failure was not being able to teach my own daughter the difference between a career and a daydream." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could hear the heartbeat in my own ears. 200 people turned in their seats to look at me. The cameras that had been filming the event pivoted their lenses toward my face. "My daughter Sloane," Arthur said, gesturing toward me with a hand that didn't tremble. "She's a brilliant girl, in her own way, but she chose a path of ghosts. She spent 5 years in a dark room, playing with algorithms and software, convinced she was building the future. I offered her a seat at this table. I offered her a place in a real empire. But she chose to chase pixels." He let out a dry, short laugh that echoed through the ballroom. "She called it Prism AI. I call it an expensive hobby. 5 years later, she's still developing while the world is still building." To the young people in this room, let Sloane be your cautionary tale. Don't trade the concrete for the virtual. Don't trade a legacy for a startup that will never make a dime. A few people at the front tables laughed, a polite, subservient titter. Then Cassandra leaned over to the woman next to her and whispered, and the laughter grew. Preston raised his glass to me, his face twisted in a mocking toast. My father stood on that stage, having just used his final professional moment to publicly disown my life's work, and he looked satisfied. He felt he had fixed the narrative. He had explained away the useless daughter to his peers so they wouldn't have to ask uncomfortable questions. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down at my plate. I sat perfectly still, my mother's silver bracelet cool against my skin. I felt the vibration in my clutch, the notification I had been waiting for. I reached down, pulled out my phone, and saw the email from the Wall Street Journal. "Story live, 8:45 p.m. Eastern Standard. Congratulations, Sloane." I looked at my watch. 8:44 p.m. Arthur was still speaking, now inviting Preston to the stage to officially hand over the keys to the firm. "To a future built on things we can touch," he shouted, raising his glass. The room began to cheer, but the cheer was interrupted. Not by me, but by the sound of 50 phones simultaneously chiming with breaking news alerts. The investors at the tables, the bankers, the lawyers, the people Arthur had spent his life trying to impress, all reached for their pockets at the same time. The blue light of 50 screens illuminated the ballroom like 1,000 tiny stars. The atmosphere changed in a heartbeat. The laughter died. The cheering stopped. My father, standing on stage with his arm around Preston, looked confused. He tapped the microphone. "Is there a problem with the signal?" I stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. I didn't need a microphone. The silence was so heavy that every rustle of my silk dress sounded like a thunderclap. "The signal is just fine, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "I think your partners just got the news." I looked at the head table. One of Arthur's biggest investors, a man who had been laughing only seconds ago, was staring at his phone with his mouth hanging open. He looked at the screen, then at me, then back at Arthur. "Arthur," the investor said, his voice trembling, "your daughter, Prism AI, they were just acquired for $50 million. The glass of Chateau Margaux slipped from Arthur's hand. It didn't shatter. It hit the thick carpet with a dull, heavy thud, the dark red wine spreading like a wound across the floor. The red wine was a jagged, ugly Rorschach test on the white silk carpet, spreading slowly around my father's feet. But Arthur Thorne didn't even look down. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on Mr. Sterling, his oldest business partner, and the man who held 40% of the debt on Arthur's latest development. Sterling wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking at his phone, his thumb feverishly scrolling through the Wall Street Journal's breaking news alert. "Arthur," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking through the absolute silence of the room. "It's not just a rumor. Global Tech Acquisitions just issued the press release. They've acquired Prism AI for $50 million, cash and stock." He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief as his gaze landed on me. "Sloan, you're the majority shareholder? You owned 90% of the equity?" I didn't answer with words. I simply stood up, the movement fluid and calm. Around me, the ballroom had transformed. The air, which only moments ago had been thick with condescension and muffled laughter, was now vibrating with a different kind of energy. Shock, realization, and greed. I saw it happen in real time. The guests who had spent the last 2 hours pointedly ignoring me, the ones who had turned their backs when I walked to my table, were now leaning in. The blue light from their phones illuminated their faces like a sea of ghosts. They weren't looking at the failed daughter anymore. They were looking at the person who had just become the most liquidly wealthy individual in the room. My stepmother, Cassandra, was frozen. Her hand was still raised, mid-gesture, as if she were trying to catch the dignity that had just evaporated from her husband's speech. The diamonds at her throat, the ones she loved to flaunt as symbols of her status, suddenly looked like costume jewelry against the sheer weight of the numbers being whispered across the tables. And then there was Preston. My stepbrother, the new king, was staring at his own phone, his face the color of old ash. He knew what I knew. He knew that the Thorne real estate books were a mess. He knew that the legacy Arthur had just handed him was a house of cards, held together by high-interest loans and fading prestige. He knew that $50 million wasn't just a number. It was a lifeline. A lifeline that was currently standing 10 feet away from him, wearing a black dress and a silent smile. "Sloan?" My father finally managed to speak. His voice was unrecognizable, thin, wavering, stripped of the booming authority that had defined my childhood. He took a step toward me, tripping slightly over the dropped glass. "50 million? You never said. You told me it was a hobby." "No, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "You called it a hobby. I called it Prism. You were so busy looking at the concrete under your feet that you forgot to look at the world changing above your head. You mocked the math, but the math doesn't have feelings. It just is." Mr. Sterling stepped forward, bypassing my father entirely. He reached out a hand to me, his professional mask back in place, but his eyes were desperate. "Sloan, we had no idea. It's revolutionary. We've been looking for a digital integration partner for our Midwest portfolio. Perhaps we could find a time to sit down." It was the same man who, 30 minutes ago, had laughed into his scotch when Arthur called me a cautionary tale. I looked at his extended hand and then back at my father. Arthur Thorne was standing in the center of his own gala, surrounded by his own portraits, and he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The spotlight was still on him, but it felt like an interrogation lamp now. He looked at the investors he had invited to witness his triumph, and he saw them looking past him. They were circling me like sharks who had just smelled blood in the water, their loyalty shifting with the speed of a high-frequency trade. I felt a strange, cold sense of clarity. For 23 years, I had wanted him to see me. I had wanted him to understand that the pixels and play pretend were real. Now, he finally saw me. But he only saw me because I had a price tag that exceeded his own. "This was your night, Arthur," I said, using his name for the first time in my life. "You wanted to talk about legacies. You wanted to talk about things that are solid. Well, I've just sold a ghost for $50 million. I think I'll leave you and Preston to figure out how to pay back Mr. Sterling with your bricks and mortar." I turned and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one whispered, "Failed daughter," now. I heard the sound of cameras clicking, not for the retirement, but for the acquisition. I reached the double doors and paused, looking back one last time. My father was still standing there, the red wine stain on the carpet looking like a wound, clutching the microphone as if it could somehow stop the floor from falling out from under him. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of 40 years of arrogance collapsing under the weight of a single news alert. The grand ballroom, once a sanctuary for Arthur Thorne's ego, now felt like a courtroom where the verdict had just been read. My father didn't move. He stood there, his hand still shaped as if it were holding the glass of wine that was now seeping into the carpet, a dark, permanent stain on his perfect evening. I didn't wait for him to find his voice. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I looked at the table of investors, men who had spent the last 2 decades nodding at Arthur while privately questioning his mounting debt. Mr. Sterling was the first to break the paralysis. He stood up, but he didn't look at Arthur. He looked at me. There was a look in his eyes I had never seen before, respect, mixed with the desperate hunger of a man who realized his biggest debtor's daughter was now his biggest potential savior. "Sloan," he said, his voice projectable but trembling. "Vidian Capital. Prism AI. You've been the force behind the recent market shifts in the West Side? We've been trying to identify the ghost firm that was outmaneuvering us for months." I gave him a short, clinical nod. "I wasn't a ghost, Mr. Sterling. I was just someone my father told you wasn't worth noticing." Beside him, Cassandra finally snapped out of her shock. She didn't go to Arthur. She didn't check if he was okay. She moved toward me, her silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers, her face a masterpiece of practiced grief. She reached out, her fingers, manicured and cold, trying to brush my arm. "Sloan, honey," she breathed, her voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We had no idea you were under so much pressure. We were only pushing you because we wanted the best for you. This is incredible news for the family. Arthur, isn't this wonderful? Our Sloan is a success." She turned to the room, trying to reclaim the narrative, trying to weave me back into the Thorne tapestry now that the tapestry was made of gold. But I saw the way her eyes darted to Preston. Preston was staring at his phone, his face drained of color. He wasn't looking at the acquisition news anymore. He was looking at his own bank alerts. He knew. He knew that the loans Arthur had co-signed for his expansion were due in 30 days. He knew that the collateral for those loans was the very building we were standing in. And he knew that the only person on the planet who could cover that shortfall without blinking was the sister he had called a failed career only 10 minutes ago. "This isn't a family victory, Cassandra," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's a business transaction. And as far as the Thorne family is concerned, you made your position very clear in the speech. I looked at Arthur. He finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. He looked at the portraits on the wall, the monuments to his solid, concrete world. And then he looked at me. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized he had spent his life building a fortress and forgot to put a roof on it. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, the crowd of Chicago's elite parting like I was the one carrying the crown. I could hear the whispers starting, the sounds of the sharks beginning to circle my father. The fallout hadn't even truly begun, but as I stepped into the cool night air of Michigan Avenue, I knew one thing. Arthur Thorne's retirement was going to be much longer and much colder than he ever imagined. I didn't make it to the elevators before I heard his voice. It wasn't the booming, floor-shaking roar of the King of Concrete. It was a thin, desperate sound that skipped across the marble floor of the lobby like a stone on ice. "Sloan! Sloan, wait!" I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood by the large glass doors, looking at my reflection. The black dress, the steady hands, the woman who had finally calculated her way out of her father's shadow. I took a breath, feeling the cool night air seep through the cracks in the door, and then I turned. Arthur Thorne was jogging toward me, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew. Behind him, I could see Cassandra standing in the entrance of the ballroom, looking at us with a face that was twisted into a mask of calculated regret. Preston was nowhere to be seen. He was likely still staring at the red wine stain on the carpet. "Sloan," Arthur said, reaching out a hand as if he were about to touch my shoulder, then pulling it back at the last second. That news. $50 million. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me stand up there and be yourself?" I finished for him. My voice was calm, clinical, the way I would explain a line of code to a junior developer. "I didn't let you do anything, Arthur. You wrote that speech. You chose those words. You spent 40 years building a legacy on the idea that I didn't exist. And tonight, you finally finished the project. I was trying to prepare you," he stammered, his eyes darting to the floor, unable to meet mine. "The world is hard, Sloan. I wanted you to be strong. I didn't think a startup could." "You didn't think I could," I corrected him. "Let's be honest for once, Dad. You didn't care about the startup. You cared that I wasn't Preston. You cared that I wasn't a mirror for your own ego." He swallowed hard, his jaw tight. I could see the gears turning in his head, the CEO calculating a new strategy. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, Sloan. The firm, Thorne Real Estate. We've hit some headwinds. The West Side project is in trouble. Sterling is threatening to pull his support. With your capital, with what you've just made, we could merge. We could build a real empire together. You and me. The Thorne name could mean everything again." I looked at him, this man who had mocked my expensive hobby only minutes ago, and I felt a sudden, sharp memory of that day in his study when I was 18. I remembered the acceptance letter I was clutching and the cold way he told me I was on my own. "Software is a toy, remember?" I said softly. "A hobby for people who are afraid to get their hands dirty." "I was wrong," he nearly shouted, his voice cracking. "I was wrong, okay? I'm your father, Sloan. I'm family. You can't just walk away when the business needs you." I looked past him at the ballroom where the music had started playing again, a hollow sound in a dying room. "You disowned me by your actions every single day for 23 years, Arthur. You moved me out of photos. You moved me into the basement. And tonight, you moved me out of your life in front of 200 people. You chose your family. You chose Cassandra. You chose Preston." I reached into my clutch and pulled out the invitation he had sent me, the one with the handwritten note telling me not to be an embarrassment. I handed it to him. You told me once that success is about having a solid foundation, I said. You built yours on arrogance and exclusion. I built mine on logic and silence. I'm not here to save your firm, and I'm not here to punish you. I'm just here to finish the transaction. Sloan, please. I hope you figure out retirement, Dad, I said, repeating the words he had said to me so many times when I was struggling in that walk-up apartment. I really do. But I'm not your backup plan. I turned and walked through the glass doors. I didn't look back to see if he was still standing there. I didn't need to. The math was finally complete, and for the first time in my life, the remainder was 0. I walked out of the Blackstone Hotel and didn't look back. The Chicago wind was biting, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shiver. I had spent 23 years trying to find a place in my father's world, only to realize that I was meant to build my own. Arthur Thorne was right about one thing. Everything beautiful starts with structure. But he was wrong about the materials. You don't need concrete and steel to build a legacy. You need courage, logic, and the willingness to stand alone when the rest of the world is laughing at you. 3 months later, Prism AI is the backbone of the industry's new digital era. My father's firm is still standing, but under a new board of directors, one that I happen to advise. Preston is finally learning what real work actually means without a safety net, and Cassandra has discovered that diamonds don't shine quite as bright when you've lost the floor beneath your feet. If you're listening to this, and you've been told that your dreams are hobbies, or that you're the failed one in your family, remember this. The people who try to shrink your world are only doing it because they're afraid of how big you can actually make it. Don't let their fear become your ceiling. Build your cathedral, line by line, and let the results do the talking. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If my journey reminded you that your worth isn't up for a vote, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community. Until next time, trust the truth, however long it takes to surface.